So good morning or good evening, and thank you everybody for being able to join tonight. We have a good number of folks that are starting to join us as attendees. We have about 30 parents and staff joining us in the attendees right now. For those who don't know me, I want to introduce myself. I'm David Parator. I'm the Chief Student Services Officer for the district, and I've had the pleasure of working in Monroe School District for the last 7 years. And I oversee special education services as well as health services, Section 504, and some other programs. Joy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Joy Castillo, and I am the special ed coordinator working here in Monroe. Just started here this fall, and I'm happy to be here.
Carlos.
Hello, Carlos A.S., Hispanic Liaison, and I'm available for translation, live translation. Estoy disponible para la traducción en vivo. Si pueden llamar al número de teléfono en la pantalla.
Thank you. And and Carlos, if it's okay, in about maybe 5 minutes, I'll stop for a minute. So then if you can just introduce yourself and your phone number again, in case some families join us a little bit later. So we wanted to, Joy and I wanted to meet with you and take about an hour with you tonight to discuss a few different topics. The first would be, we'd like to talk around school emergency planning for our various drills. So we'd like to spend some concentrated time there talking about what we've done so far, what we're hoping to do, and kind of give you a timeline of how we will get everything articulated into a plan for the district. Then we'd also like to spend some time talking about recovery services, which is continuing. And recovery services are some additional supplemental special education supports for our students with disabilities. And this is related to some of the education that students lost during the COVID pandemic last year and into this year. And so building out those supports to make up some of those services for students who have not made as much growth as you would have expected in the last year. And then we'd like to finish up by just briefly talking about some proposed changes in our speech language therapy service delivery model. Just kind of talking about some kind of more progressive ways that we're looking at providing services for our students. So one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of have this meeting in the evening is there's been a lot of conversation in the last couple of years around, in our district, how are we planning for our students with disabilities, both visible disabilities as well as unidentified disabilities, for students in our various emergency drills and evacuation plans. What sort of processes are we putting in place to make sure we are systematically thinking about our students with disabilities? So we've started to build off of the things, the concerns. Our district does have an overarching emergency operation plan that has very detailed around all of our drills. But what we were noticing is that there's not a lot of real articulated and more specificity for our students with disabilities. So we wanted to kind of more thoughtfully look at what we're doing right now in our district in this area, and then wanted to look at what are some additional things that we can do, and then how can we memorialize that in our emergency operating plan to make sure that it is truly clear to our staff and our families as far as what they can expect and what our students can expect through the drills. So Joy and I started going out and meeting with some different school teams to talk about what they were doing and kind of the considerations that they were doing. One of the things that we realized at that point was our school teams have really been thinking through these things at the school level and at the IP team level. And they've thought through what they're going to do for all the students on their caseloads, but they haven't really we don't really have a plan in place to really articulate what that looks like in writing. So Joy has helped develop a template for our at the student specific level around what that might look like. And so we'll share that in just a moment and have Joy kind of talk through kind of the thinking through why we're having these considerations for our IEP teams to discuss with their families. We also wanted to really, as we're doing our planning, we don't want to be tone deaf to what is really needed by our families as far as things that they want to be considered and to have considerations for. So some of those school team meetings have had parent input to them, and then also working with some families, and invited Heather in last week to help plan for some things that maybe I'm not thinking about, Joy is not thinking about around our planning for students with disabilities, and really wanting to partner with our parents to truly get a sense, make sure that when we do come up with a plan, that the plan is meaningful and that it resonates with our families. One of the things that we also realized as we were meeting, and last week we had a meeting with Greg Burns, who is our Director of Risk and Management, and Mike Birch, who is our Director of Transportation. And again, we have a lot of the systems that are already in place in isolated areas. And so talking with Mike Birch, part of their yearly plans with their transportation department is 3 times a year, they do drills on their buses, and they have in their transportation safety plan, they have a section specifically for students who have disabilities and who has special circumstances. So they're already practicing those pieces. But what Greg, Mike, and I, and Jonathan Judy, who was at that meeting, discussed was that we really need to get this into a centralized place where everybody can see that plan. And so it's not living in a whole lot of different houses. So one of our goals that we'd like to hopefully be able to reach by the end of this school year is to, within our district-wide emergency operation plan, have a section that is specifically for the different processes for our students with disabilities. And that will be able to be then followed by all of our different schools. So that is kind of the big picture area as far as getting everything into one centralized location. I want to let Joy share a little bit about the planning that we've been doing at the student specific level. And let me see if I can get my screen shared here. But Joy, do you want to talk a little bit? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And this was just some of our initial thoughts around the planning that our teams can do at the school level. And then these documents, when we finalize them, will also be then attached to the IEPs so that they'll follow students from program to program and as they matriculate up from elementary to middle to high school, so that everybody who works with the students is aware of this student-specific planning that needs to occur for our students.
Thank you, David. Yeah, as David had mentioned, I think our guide, starting from the district, is to work with the district emergency documents to create a checklist for the building principals to consider when they're doing their building specific plans, but also make it easier for them with links to documents that are universal across our system. So thinking about, in a level, most students respond to just the way the drills are presented and the way drills are as is, but there are those students that will need special considerations, thinking of our tier 2 and tier 3 students who may have additional needs. And again, this is just a work in progress, but looking through ADA documents, consulting with partners, at the ARC, and reviewed some other documents, it seems like where some individuals may differ are in 4 main areas. One being, how do we have students understand the concept of a drill? Some students might just be fine just through the typical building-wide classroom practice. Some students might need modified visuals to understand what's happening during a drill and what they should do during a drill. So how do we consider how we're teaching those students that may need that level? And then the other main need during in a drill, we have our notification needs, right? Not everybody might respond to an alarm in the same way. Some students might freeze. Some may not hear it if they're hard of hearing and may need, a more flashing light. So we need to consider how is a student notified and what happens to their particular need or skill level when there's an alarm. And then evacuation needs, should students need to be evacuated. Students might have a temporary disability and need a way to get from a second floor to a first floor. Some students may have a permanent disability or a lack of skill yet where they might need different supports in helping them evacuate safely. Another area is, and this is in my observations of various drills this year out at the schools, it seems like where we need maybe more work is in how students shelter in place or wait. So for some students, waiting is really hard. So if you go down, David, you'll see there's a section for what are the waiting needs for a student, which also will include thinking about potential reunification needs, right? So again, then in those documents for the building principals, we could have links to something like universal identification for our emergency personnel. We can have a link to this document. And this is kind of just like the think through that teams are already doing, but in a place that is universal across our district. So we get used to thinking through and sharing this information among more people in our buildings. Did I explain that okay, David, or do you need?
No, I think that
Okay.
That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things to know about this also is this is still very much at the draft level.
Yeah.
What we've started doing is we meet monthly with the special education advisory committee in the district. And that's made up of different special education staff from all different job disciplines. So we have some teachers who teach our structured learning centers. We have our behavior teachers. We have preschool teachers. So we put this out to them to get input would this be meaningful for them to use in planning for their students, as well as what additional things aren't we considering. One of the other pieces that we're really going to be seeking is parent input to this as well. And so following this meeting, one of the things that we will be doing, we'll be posting this webinar onto the website. But in the next week or so, we'll follow up with a written communication to all of our families. So families that were able to attend here today, as well as those who weren't able to attend but may have watched the webinar at a later date. And what we'd like to do is also solicit input, both in writing as well as hopefully do some different smaller task force to meet to kind of refine our processes and really kind of some of the work that we're doing here will guide what then gets finally uploaded into our emergency operating plan district-wide. And again, my goal is to have this completed by the time we leave for summer vacation. That way, when we come back in August and are doing our kickoff meetings with our building administrators as well as with our school staff, our principals and schools will have training materials so that they're actually able to be practicing these pieces and be fully implementing into next year. But we will be soliciting more parental input to that. We'll continue to meet with parents, kind of give them updates where we're at, and then being able to share a final product by the time we come to summer. I do have a question in the question box. I'm just asking to define what kind of disabilities we're talking about that kids have. And this is really, this is wide ranging for all of our students. Actually, let me take, I think, I believe Carlos is translating for some people. Just want to make sure people were fully accessing Carlos tonight. When we're looking at students with disabilities, we're looking at students with both visible disabilities and sometimes not visible disabilities. Oftentimes, we know students who are on IEPs have certain levels of disability. So that could be anywhere from a speech deficit to more or academic deficits. But it could be more students who have more significant disabilities that affect their mobility. So they may be wheelchair bound or have more could be medically fragile. And so some of this really specific planning for those students really allows us, some students are good, a lot of our students with disabilities are going to be able to respond as every other student does in an emergency drill. Other students, it's going to take more specialized planning, as well as our staff needing to practice how to evacuate students in an emergency crisis. For example, if a student is in a classroom on the second floor and the student is confined to a wheelchair, if we had a fire or a fire drill, we wouldn't be able to use the elevator to bring the student down. So training on using our specialized evacu chairs, how do we get those students safely in their wheelchair from the second floor down to the first floor in a safe way? So it's really planning for all levels of disabilities. One of the things at our meeting at Hidden River that a parent brought up also that is a very good point is not all students with disabilities are identified on an IEP or individualized education plan or a Section 504 plan. That's our two avenues for supporting students with disabilities, but they may have more a disability that doesn't require specialized school planning, but it's nevertheless needs planning. So we have students who might have an anxiety disorder, who may respond differently if they're hearing loud alarms go off. So really kind of thinking through for all of our students in our schools, as well as not just students with disabilities, but students who may have language differences, who may not have the understanding of English to be able to process directions that are just being given in English in an emergent situation. So how are we planning for those students? So it's really looking at it. It starts at the school level, but then it gets down to the program level, and then we boil it down to the very specific student level. Kind of with that, is there other questions around? We do have time, and again, we'll be soliciting questions and input later through written documentation. But is there other questions right now that people might have around our emergency planning for students with disabilities? Yes, we have a question asking if we have self-contained classrooms in our schools. We do have some classrooms that our self-contained classrooms are more of a home base for our students with some more that are more impacted by their disabilities. But with those self-contained classrooms, our district has really been working at developing more inclusive practices. So while that classroom might be their home base for a significant portion of their school day, those students also are going out into their general education classrooms. And that is also one of the reasons why some of this planning is necessary and being able to practice these drills is the students aren't always going to be in their kind of home-based classroom. They could be on the second floor or in a PE classroom or in the cafeteria, and we need to have planning in place for all environments within the school. Okay, I'm just going to read this question. May I suggest that as you decide how the final product will be distributed and applied, that you look at it from the perspective of a substitute or a volunteer's perspective. As a substitute lunch lady, I see how often people take for granted the sharing of important information. An emergency can happen when those who have practiced are out sick, and it may be substitutes, volunteers, or other students to apply the needed steps. I think that is a great point, because we have substitutes in our buildings every day of the year. We also have substitute bus drivers oftentimes, substitute paraeducators, and a plan is only as good as people understanding what that plan is. And so that was actually one of the things that Heather and I discussed last week, and she brought this up, was that, you know, we need to have a plan in place for when we have new people in our buildings, and also a way for, as we hire substitutes throughout the year, and so we need to make sure that those folks are getting the training on this on an ongoing basis. So yes, very good point, and take your point very well, Cheryl, because I think that is something. There's a lot to this, and as we kind of get things more and more, as we think through each of these topics, more and more specific items come up, and so it requires a very detailed plan. But at the same time, we want our plan to be detailed enough to meet the needs of all of our students, but we don't want it to become so cumbersome that people aren't able to truly understand it. And so that's where kind of looking at kind of finding that sweet spot of comprehensiveness, but then making it very user-friendly for all of our staff. Yes, very much, April. Being aware of the annual staff turnover and having to retrain annually. Yes, and this is going to be cyclical, because also for our students with disabilities, their needs are going to change depending on the environment that they're in. So the plan that's in place when they're in elementary school is going to need to be adjusted as they move to middle school, from when they're just in one classroom to when they're going to 6 classrooms. So really looking at with annual training for staff each year in all buildings. But yes, very good points, and things that we're starting to really kind of think through what those different pieces would look like. Any other questions for this topic before we go on? And again, I'd like to get a nice representative of parent input, so that we have some input from elementary parents, middle school parents, high school parents, so that we really making sure we're looking at our student body as a whole, and just kind of the various different things that we want to consider. The next piece that we just wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about is our recovery services for students with IEPs. And again, this we're going on 2 years where we've been affected by the pandemic, and last March of 2020 with the complete school closure, and then into last school year where we were in closure for the beginning of the year, and then when we came back in hybrid model. So throughout last year, students were not receiving. We had some programs that were running pretty much as they typically would for our students with some of our students with disabilities, but most of our students did not have as many services as that they typically would on a Monday through Friday 6-hour school day. So with that, we did experience a loss of learning for a lot of our students, and for students on IEPs, we would anticipate that they'd make a certain level of growth each year on their goals. And if they didn't meet that expected amount of growth, then they would be then they can be eligible for recovery services. And what recovery services is are supplemental services that students will get in addition to what they're getting during the school year. So last summer, we recognized that our students last year missed out on services. So we had a lot of students that received recovery services during the summer, both at the elementary level as well as secondary level. So we started meeting that need last year. This year, we are having our IEP teams identify students that they, again, looking at the data to see, did they not make as much expected growth as we would have thought they would have if they had been going to school full time. And they're identifying those students, and then we're beginning to make our planning for that. This year, it's going to look, we're starting to look at the data that's coming in for our students, and we will be building programming both for some additional summer programming, as well as we have some additional programming that we're starting to get in place now. And Joy's done a fantastic job kind of looking through some different programming options for students to start getting those services now. And Joy, can you share a little bit about the Lexia program and kind of what that looks like and what students that might be best suited for?
Sure, yeah. And looking through our students that were qualifying for recovery, there were a group of students that seemed to qualify only in the area of reading, and more likely, perhaps due to lack of repeated progress, perhaps there's dyslexia involved, perhaps another type of reading disability. So with the help of some teachers, we identified a program called Lexia and purchased this product. And some of the teachers who have identified students that could benefit from this have access to the training and have undergone the training. And then students would be provided with this particular product to use, which is web-based. What's great about that, though, is just a small amount of practice per day on the product has an evidence base of really accelerating learning when there's gaps, especially when it comes to phonemes or basic reading skills. The other neat thing about the product is if there's an error pattern when students are practicing and it's not remediated by the program itself, the teacher's flagged, and the teacher knows about this pattern of error and has a direct instruction program right there to work with the student on that particular challenge area and skill deficit. So teachers are just now starting to use it and having their students have access to this program if it fits. That's just one of the many options we're thinking to help our students accelerate their learning.
And again, that's one option that we're thinking, and it's for reading and comprehension, that's an area that we know a lot of students we're needing some additional services, but we're looking at that for other, as we start to finalize the list of students that are needing recovery services. We're going to be seeking out other programs that are kind of best matched to that area of need, so that we're really being targeted to help students regain that progress and get back kind of up where they would have been. This would the goal would be to hopefully finish our recovery services this summer, but we know we might continue to be providing recovery services the following school year as well. So this is it's a work in progress, and we're going to continue to build that out as we continue to identify the needs of our students. If you do have questions about your students and the recovery services and the IEP team has not met with you yet this year, please bring that up to your case managers at your school, and they can talk to you, and they can talk to Joy and myself, as well as our teacher on special assignment, Christy Barr, around making sure that we're getting those students identified for the services. As students, as IEPs are rolling through on just the annual cycle, there is a new piece on the IEP form that does require you to talk about this during an IEP meeting. So to date, as of this morning, we've had through IEPs since about beginning of November, about 423 IEPs have had this conversation. We know additional folks have had these conversations outside the IEP process. So conversations are happening. If you haven't had that specific conversation with your IEP team, please reach out to your case managers or to your building administrator, just to make sure that we don't want to miss any students, and we want to make sure that we're meeting those needs. Look through here as questions. Right now, again, we're building our summer plan. Last year, it was 3 weeks. We don't have a defined duration of how many days, how many weeks we'll be doing the programming, as well as kind of the length of the day. We are planning this, again, students who are on IEPs are general education students first. So we're also building our summer services programming in conjunction with the learning and teaching department, to be supplemental to what they have in place. Last year they had the STEM focus, which was really very successful for students. It was very engaging. We also want to acknowledge it's a lot of work for our students to be going to school Monday through Friday, from September through June. So we want to make sure that we're making our activities engaging for our students, so that they're enjoying coming for summer services. That it's working important. And then some of the reading programs available for all students. So that again, that will be some of what the district looks at as far as when they're building out their summer services. With our students on IEPs, we do receive some special funding to help provide that. And so some of the funding is specific to students on IEPs, while other funding for recovery services and for additional services because of the loss of learning is open to all students. So those are some of the conversations that we'll be having with the learning and teaching department to make sure our plan is comprehensive, to not just meet the needs of our students on IEPs, but for all students who require it. Again, some good questions here. No, special education services, it is our obligation to meet the needs of our students on IEPs. So as we identify needs for students on and they're identified on an IEP, that is then the district's obligation is to find a way to provide those services. So regardless if a levy fails, we will continue to meet the needs of our special education students. Other questions around, we're doing pretty well on we're actually a few minutes ahead on our agenda, so we're doing really well here. But additional questions around recovery services. Again, we'll be getting out some updates in the next couple of weeks where we're at now, but then there'll be additional communications kind of as the plan starts to get solidified for summer planning. Our hope is really to have this completely planned out and communicated to our families as early as possible, so families can take this into account when they're doing their summer planning. The last thing that we wanted to talk about, and this is something that Joy has been working on with our speech therapist group, is some new ways of providing our speech services that are a little bit more progressive and kind of more suited to kind of the educational settings that we're in now. So Joy, do you want me to share my screen and pull that?
Yes, please. Sure. And we have been working on this with our speech language pathologists, but also our occupational therapists and our physical therapists as well. So I just want to mention that. So at the beginning of the year, we decided we were going to explore a variety of service models and dosages that have provided the best inclusive outcomes for students, and to be more aligned with some other districts in the state who have moved to different service models. And so this particular support, David, can you put share so we can go down to that?
Present, yes, let me see. There we go, sorry about that.
No worries, but you're gonna click then, there we go. Support for this service model, the one that our team has really thought would work best for our students and in alignment with our inclusive model in Monroe, is supported by ASHA, which is the American Speech Language Hearing Association, and the American Occupational Therapy Association, AOTA, and then APTA, the American Physical Therapy Association, and is also consistent with IDEA regulations that requires us to look at how our special ed efforts are integrated with our general education outcomes as well. Next, David. So in a nutshell, who does this involve? It involves those itinerant services that may serve your students. So your occupational therapist, your physical therapist, your speech language pathologist. In a nutshell, what it is 3 weeks of direct service. And in the next slide, I'll do a quick review of what direct service and indirect services are. And then 1 week of indirect service. And the key is all will have the same indirect week. That's really important for collaboration and all that, as you will see. And how will this roll out and how does it happen? Your provider will use their professional judgment based on data to propose this model to the IEP team if they believe this particular model will benefit your students. So these have already been happening slowly, kind of a slow rollout. So typically they happen at your next IEP. They can also happen at an amendment meeting. Some speech pathologists already know, looking at their data, that would really benefit a large chunk of their students, large population. So they may be calling for an amendment as well. Next slide.
My cursor moved, sorry.
No worries. Oh, go back. You went a little one. Oh, actually, no, you don't need to go back. Never mind. So the big why are we changing the model? And I know often it can seem like why is less more? It seems like my student might be getting less services. The big why is indirect services are critical to student success, and giving time and space for those indirect services has shown to actually increase growth in students and not decrease growth. Providers focus on aligning the student services with the student's learning environment, which really helps with the generalization of skills. We know with several students, they can pull out and use a skill in a one-on-one setting with their speech pathologist or OT, but they need to use it in the real world. So this helps with the generalization of those skills and that practice and the training of other people around the student so that more gains can happen. Okay, next slide. Just a quick reminder, direct services are those direct interventions of, where they might pull out your student or come in, test, work on that therapy, those skills. And indirect services, in the next slide, David. Here's some examples of some indirect services that happen on that 4th week. When a SLP has that whole 4th week to go support the students, what happens is they're allowed the time to perhaps maybe a student is having the most challenge with communication in a PE class. Well, now they'll be able to go and observe that student over the PE class and get an idea of supports that could help that student, or train those around the teachers around of how you can make improvement in that area. So allows for more collaboration and consultation with others throughout that week. More specific adaptation of materials and equipment gives our providers the time to really tweak if there's an AAC device or more specific visuals, that type of stuff. And then also just, increasing the fidelity of programming and to stay current with evidence-based interventions, so that we also more training and more collaboration can happen amongst each other as professionals. Next slide. Of course, why this model and why can less be more for our students? There are many reasons. I just pull out a few of them. But through this model, it does increase the availability of our SLPs, OTs, PTs to staff and parents in the schools. As I mentioned before, they're more able to go into the classrooms during academic times to view progress, or even to partner with the teachers there in special projects. Seeing if there is generalization happening, and if not, what to do about it. And overall, just, more collaboration. It also helps with an increased awareness of typical performance at each grade level. For example, our OTs, they might be able to put in lessons for handwriting at the kindergarten level using this model that, help students before they become ingrained habits that lead to more the need for intervention later. But all in all, it supports inclusive practices. Next slide. Of course, there's always the what if, right? And what if you think your child or your student needs a different service model? As always, the IEP makes a data-based decision. And if there's not adequate progress with that model, or if it's just not the right model for your student, of course, we adjust the model or look at other potential adjustments that can be made to the programming in order to increase that rate of progress. So again, just like everything with an IEP, there's not one size fits all. But from the starting point of this model, we do believe that it will really help with our inclusive practices and student progress. And that's it. Other questions about this type of model?
Joy, there was one question, and I think, I'm not sure when the question came up, and I think you kind of went into it a little bit more, but maybe talk a little bit more about the difference between direct versus indirect services.
Okay, so direct services, if you think of, I'll just use an SLP as an example. They have at least 48 students on their caseload. So their day is serving those students, right? Whether it's a small group or pushing into a self-contained classroom and doing a lesson, pulling a student out to work on articulation therapy. Their day is filled up, scheduled, right? And that's the direct service, doing the direct intervention directly with the student. Now on that indirect week where they all have off, they won't have those appointments scheduled, but they could go in and go into a self-contained classroom and watch how the student does at other parts of the day and train and model for a paraprofessional or the teacher. They could go into the gen ed classroom during maybe the STEM time and see how the student is interacting using those speech and those social skills that they had taught with them that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So indirect means, they're more consultation, more modeling, more observing, and then giving feedback. And quite often intervening as well, just not in those scheduled sessions. Did I explain that okay?
Yeah, I think that was a good explanation. I think a thing with this model is allowing that additional time for the generalization of the skills that are worked on in that small therapy room, because we want students to go with that speech example. It's not enough just to be able to do that, have that skill in front of the therapist. You need to be able, the kids need to be able to do that skill when they're talking to their peers in their classroom, when they're talking with their teacher, or when they're applying it. So it allows that extra practice, and then that observation, and kind of supporting what's happening in the therapy room. Then this indirect then supports that therapy time into the classroom. So it builds a stronger foundation for those skills, and then it makes it more sustainable for those skills being retained. So I think it's a real promising model for our students. But also realizing one size does not fit all. So for some students, this is going to be the preferred model. Other students, it may not. So that's one of the things that we need to look at with all of our service delivery options in our district, that we need to build these delivery options for the individual needs of students, not just, there's not just the Monroe way, it's the way of each individual student. Is there any additional questions? We were like doing really well in our time. We have about 10 minutes left here. So one of the things, just a reminder, we will be getting this recording up as soon as we can onto our website, and that'll be on the Student Services website, as well as our communications department usually postings in a couple of different places within our website. But we'll try to also communicate that out to all of our families so they know where they can find that, because we know we had at our max, we had about 42 families on today, but we know there's a lot more families that are interested in this information. Just sometimes 6 to 7 for all families does not work. And so trying to find a time that works for everyone just is impossible. So making this accessible for everybody by recording it is one of our goals. But then also, really, again, Joy and I take it seriously when we want your input and feedback for our planning, because we don't want to go too far down a pathway and then realize it's really not meeting the needs of our families. So that feedback to us is really critical, so that we build a plan that's going to meet the needs of our students in the district. Joy, there was one more question that said, when is this new approach expected to be put into practice in the schools?
Okay, so some of our, oh, I'm good. There's some feedback, David. There we go. Some of our, I know our SLPs or OTs have already been talking to families and proposing this model for students who it makes sense for at IEPs. So I would expect now, anytime, in your next IEP or even before, if your provider thinks that it should happen and it would be good for your student for it to happen sooner.
Anything else? I really appreciate people taking an hour out of your evenings to join us. We like getting this information out to our families. Last year we had done, I was able to do almost 1/4 of these meetings. So I'd like to get back to doing these more frequently again, especially the Zoom format does allow for more parent participation and attendance. So that is something that I'd like to continue on. Also, in that communication that we put out to the families, if there's topics that you'd like us to address at one of these special education parent meetings. If you let us know that, we can prepare the content, bring in speakers if appropriate, and really make sure that these hour meetings are really kind of tailored to what you're wanting to hear. We know that the emergency planning for students with disabilities was a very high interest, so we wanted to take the time tonight to kind of lay out where we're at and kind of what our plan is. But there's a whole host of other topics that we'd love to talk with you about. So again, really appreciate everybody taking the time tonight. I'm going to stop the recording now. And then we will look forward to seeing all of you at our next meeting, possibly at our next board meeting. So we will talk with you all soon. Thank you so much.